We begin our public proceedings of the Education Select Committee this morning. Can I welcome members of the committee and witnesses to our session today. This is the fifth of our evidence sessions on our major inquiry, Solving the SEND Crisis, and this morning we're considering accountability across the SEND system. Can I invite our witnesses to introduce yourselves to us, please, starting with Georgina.
Hi there, I'm Georgina Downard, Senior Solicitor at IPSEA, which is the independent provider of special education advice. We're a charity which provides free and independent advice to parents and carers of children and young people with special educational needs across England. We do that through our free helplines, information service and tribunal support service, and we also provide training to parents and various professionals in SEN law and challenge unlawful policy.
Sharon, Chappell, Assistant Ombudsman with the Local Government and Social Care Ombudsman. We investigate complaints about councils and private care providers.
Hi, I'm Lucy Harte. I'm Deputy Director for Multi-Agency Operations at the Care Quality Commission. Care Quality Commission is the independent regulator of health and social care, but the teams that sit in my function are the teams that do inspections with other inspectorates, so including the team that delivers the joint area SEND inspections with Ofsted.
Good morning, my name is Adam Sproston. I'm a Senior His Majesty's Inspector at Ofsted for SEND and Alternative Provision.
Thank you very much, and I'll begin our questioning this morning. So we know from our own experience as constituency MPs and also from the evidence that we've received on this inquiry that accountability is key to ensuring high quality SEND provision across local authorities, health and education services. In brief, how would you evaluate the effectiveness of the current accountability system for SEND? I might start, Sharon, with you, if that's okay.
Absolutely. Well, we're extremely robust in holding councils and local authorities to account in terms of SEND failings. We remedy injustice for the individual alongside making service improvement recommendations to try and drive performance on a wider basis. But we consider there significant gaps in the lack of jurisdiction over schools, academies, free schools. So that's where we see the gaps and lack of effectiveness for individual complaints in those settings.
Thank you. You didn't mention health at all in your response.
We have a joint working team, and they do look at some SEND complaints where health is very intrinsically linked to the social care and education provision. But it's a small team and it's relatively small numbers. What we have heard back though from our colleagues in NHS England is the small number of cases that we've investigated and issued decisions involving health and councils have had a significant impact. So it's good to know.
Thank you. Georgina?
Well, at IPSEA, our view is that the system, in terms of the legal framework, could be effective if it were fully implemented. But it is widely not implemented, and as a result, children and young people are not getting the support that they need when they need it. And this is in part because accountability needs strengthening. And I can comment more on that perhaps as we go through.
Thank you. Lucy?
Yeah, sure. So we started our current area SEND framework inspection in 2023. It is the only independent inspection activity that holds the local partnership to account. So the local partnership being the bodies that are responsible for commissioning the SEND services in that local area. When we started the inspections in 2023, that wasn't too long after the Health and Care Act had made significant structural changes to the way that services are commissioned. And we have seen through our inspection activity that has had a really significant impact on some of those partnerships that provide care and services to children and people with SEND. We are incredibly mindful of the recent announcements as well that have been made in terms of those NHS restructures and ICB cuts, and I know that's been mentioned in previous evidence as well, hasn't it? We have attempted, and I think we've done well through our area SEND inspection framework, to hold local partners to account for activity and actions that require the most pressing action. I think that then after our inspection activity where there's significant weaknesses, NHSE and DFE work together to support that local area. The accountability systems that go beyond that, then there are some gaps in how that accountability works. So, for example, NHS services have their performance oversight framework that's gone out for consultation. There are differences in how the partnership is held to account. But we have made significant changes through our SEND inspection framework in an attempt to do that.
Thank you. Adam.
Thank you. I'd support Lucy's answers in regards to the Area SEND framework and just clarify the point that we are the only inspection framework that looks at a partnership. So the partnership, of course, is local authority partners, social care, education and the teams that sit within those services and the health providers, and how effectively they work together to support children and young people with SEND. In our other activity at Ofsted, we've always had a focus on children with SEND throughout our work in early years, schools and further education and skills, and we have recently received a consultation response that we will respond to the committee with in due course that has a focus on inclusion, and I am aware that we'll possibly discuss that later today. I also wanted to talk about the wider work of Ofsted. So, for example, in our initial teacher education inspections and how we're holding those providers to account for upskilling the teachers of the future to prepare them to meet the needs that they will face in the classroom.
Thank you, and we will come on to some of that detail. Can I ask you again briefly, what changes do you believe are needed to strengthen the accountability system for SEND, perhaps starting this time with Lucy?
Yeah. Through our Area SEND inspection activity, we have, under this current framework, we've identified the relevant partners that would that need to act when we have identified significant concerns. We've also strengthened accountability through inspection activity so that after every inspection, every full Area SEND inspection, regardless of the outcome, local area partnerships, so the people that Adam's just described, would be responsible for updating their strategic action plan. At this point in time, we have taken some time to do a review of our Area SEND inspection framework, and that we will publish in due course. But that currently means that as an inspectorate, we haven't gone back out and done monitoring visits yet. And so that for the inspectorates will be part of what will give us some of that information about the effectiveness of our SEND inspections in holding those local area partnerships to account. So both the monitoring visits, but also the cycle of inspections that's commissioned under this current Area SEND framework. So we will be going back out and doing full inspections as well to those areas after we focus on those risk areas. So I think it's probably fair to say from an inspectorate perspective, we will have more evidence and kind of and a view once we've gone out and done our monitoring visits and our subsequent full inspections about how the current inspection is contributing to that accountability in the system.
Thank you, Sharon.
As I've already alluded, we feel there's a need to strengthen accountability by giving us jurisdiction over SEND issues in schools. And when I say schools, I mean maintained schools, academies, free schools. We have asked for this several times. Our current triennial review repeats the request. Our previous triennial review also asked for that. We also have asked for jurisdiction for admissions and exclusions, and in doing so we're very conscious that children and young people with SEN are disproportionately affected in terms of admission arrangements and exclusions. We can look holistically to a certain extent. We can look at social care, we can look at education, but only through the lens of the local authority. On some occasions, we can look at health, as I've already referred to, in terms of our joint working team, but we have to stop at the school gates. And in the course of our investigations, we often see evidence of things going wrong in schools, which won't come as a surprise. Sorts of things we see: part-time timetables for extended periods, off-rolling, unofficial exclusions, failure to provide what is detailed in an EHC plan. But we can't look at those, and we can't hold schools to account. It leaves a really significant gap in the accountability framework, and we feel that drives parents to go down the route of requesting EHC needs assessments and fighting for plans as a form of sort of added extra protection. So if there was robust accountability for schools, we feel that may reduce the numbers who feel they have to go down that route. We also share all our learning, so we issue focus reports to councils which shares the learning and what we see from complaints, and we could very much do the same for that with school jurisdiction to help drive performance and improve performance on a wider basis.
I just wanted to comment.
Just very quickly, given that you've requested this oversight a number of times, what have been the reasons for not giving you this oversight? Because it does sound like it would be very helpful.
We're not entirely sure. We didn't get a formal response to our last triennial review. We are told that we will get a formal response in several months to the current triennial review. So we did have jurisdiction over schools for a very short period back in 2012 and proved to be successful. But when the coalition government came in, that legislation was rescinded. So I think the sort of academisation programme didn't necessarily fit with what we were doing at the time.
Thank you.
I'll go to Adam.
We would seek to, anything that could support partnership working. So in areas that typically support children with SEND more effectively through our Area SEND framework, it's because the partnership are cohesive, they communicate effectively with each other, for example, through effective information sharing, systems work, and also joint commissioning, including children, young people and families as well. So anything that could support a partnership approach, we would welcome.
Through the accountability framework?
Through the accountability framework, yes. So anything that could aid, I suppose, the efficiency of information sharing. We find different teams on different systems, for example, and quite regularly highlight that as challenges in areas that don't do as well for children and young people.
Thank you. Georgina.
Well, the key to resolving the current situation lies in ensuring local authorities comply with their duties to children and young people with special educational needs, which, to be clear, don't entitle them to anything more than what they need. And at IPSEA, we have identified some key changes that we think would support this. So firstly, local authorities should be expected to make lawful decisions about assessment and provision for children and young people with SEND and face consequences when they don't. Secondly, it's our view that the Department for Education should consult with local authorities about any barriers and what they might need in order to comply with those duties, and to review local policy to ensure that it is in line with the law. Thirdly, it would strengthen accountability if Ofsted inspections incorporated the extent to which schools comply with their duties to be fully inclusive to those with special educational needs, and additionally for area SEND inspections to prioritise monitoring that compliance with the legal duties to these children. We fully support the Ombudsman's request for the extension of their jurisdiction to cover schools, and we certainly think that would strengthen our accountability in the way that Sharon has explained. And we also believe that making SEN support statutory, the support for those children and young people who don't have EHC plans, would be a significant improvement in terms of accountability. That would need to be accompanied by adequate funding, of course, and training for school staff. And I'd be happy to talk more about sort of why we feel that is important and how we'd envisage that being introduced either now or later on, if you're going to have a separate question on it.
Thank you. I think we will come to that a little bit later on. But I did want to ask you specifically, Georgina, just now, about the tribunal system. So it's clear that increasing numbers of families are turning to the tribunal as the way of securing the commitment that they need within the EHCP process, although I think it's also always important to say when we talk about the tribunal that tribunal cases still represent only 2% of the total number of applications, and it is inherently a process that is unfair to families that don't have the resources to be able to go to the tribunal. But I wanted to ask you what action you believe is needed to prevent this increasing escalation, and some of the things you've said already, I think, but to ensure that there is more satisfaction in the system, more children whose needs are being met without the need for that kind of very formal type of challenge.
Sure. So the onus absolutely should not be on parents to have to fight for what their child needs and what they're entitled to and go through the lengthy appeals referred to. It wouldn't be if local authorities were adequately resourced and if they made decisions in line with the law the first time around. And it shouldn't be accepted that they don't. So what we need is a zero tolerance approach to authorities not complying with their legal duties to children and young people with special educational needs and disabilities. And by that I mean not complying with the existing legal framework. Local authorities should be expected to make lawful decisions about these children, and they should be sanctioned if they don't. So at the moment we see the same authorities making the same unlawful decisions on repeat, and that they can effectively put off revisiting that until a tribunal hearing many months down the line. And as you said, that's actually if the parent is able to appeal. Not everyone can or will, and some will face challenges which will make that much more difficult. Imagine, for example, if your housing situation was unstable, or your child was in youth custody, or perhaps you don't have access to a computer, or as a parent you have your own special educational needs or disability. We can't forget about these families that don't actually make it to the tribunal. We frequently at IPSEA see local policies which don't comply with the law, and they in turn then lead to unlawful decisions which are successfully challenged. So if local policy consistently and accurately reflected the legal position, we believe that this would then lead to lawful decisions and less need to appeal. At IPSEA, we engage with local authorities around securing corrections to their policies when we have the capacity to. But we should not be in a situation where members of the public and charitable organisations are effectively policing public bodies' misinterpretation or disregard for the law. So as I mentioned, an alternative to this that we see would be the Department for Education proactively reviewing local policies to ensure that they are legally accurate and taking action when they're not. If the department were to do this systematically, some form of initial review, we would then see it as something that could be monitored in joint area inspections moving forward. So I'd summarise that local authorities need to be adequately resourced. The Department for Education should be consulting with authorities about what they need to comply with these duties and looking at their local policies. And unlawful decisions should not be acceptable, and there should be negative consequences when they're made. And the form of that, whether that's financial or reputational or consequences in both areas, would, I believe, be something for policymakers to bottom out. But as I said, we do see joint area inspections playing a role in that.
I'll bring Caroline in a moment, but before I do that, I just want to ask you briefly about the interaction between the funding landscape and the accountability that we talked about. So I don't think anybody, it's not a controversial statement to say that public bodies should comply with the law. I don't think there's any disagreement about that. But when we look at the funding landscape is absolutely dire. There's a £3 billion national deficit in the SEND budget, and it's increasing every single year, and we have the kind of inadequate fix of the statutory override. So I just want to ask, in that context, what is the solution that gets to better compliance? Because it seems also that kind of sanctioning local authorities for not complying with the law, if the reason for that is that they don't have the resources, further penalises exactly the kind of children whose needs are already not being met.
Well, this is where a decision needs to be made about priorities. And the question is really, or the decision that needs to be made, is whether children and young people with special educational needs and disabilities are important enough to prioritise and to fund. And it's our view that any decision that they're not would amount to the public endorsement of devaluing children and young people with special educational needs in this country. They deserve just as much right to fulfil their potential as those who don't have SEN, so should be prioritised in terms of these funding discussions as well.
Thank you. I'm going to go to Manuela. Thanks.
Thank you, Chair. So my question is for Georgina. I've become very familiar with the mediation process because I now sit on mediation meetings in support of my families in the constituency. And I want to ask you what improvements could be made to mediation and also other dispute resolution processes at local authority level to help prevent issues from escalating to the send tribunal or even judicial review?
Sure. Well, I would say that in some cases, when a parent is fully informed, and perhaps when you're there to support them, mediation can be effective in resolving issues without the need for an appeal and quicker. But only if the local authority and, where relevant, the Integrated Care Board complies with the law that governs that. So we frequently hear that that's not happening. For example, we often hear of local authorities sending a member of staff to mediation who doesn't have the authority to settle the issues that are in dispute, even though there's a legal requirement for them to send someone with that decision-making power. Instead, authorities are often sending somebody else who effectively just says, I'm going to have to take that back to a decision maker or to a panel that might not be due to meet for some time in the future. And for some parents, that might mean they inadvertently miss their opportunity to appeal. So that's a breach of the SEND regulations, which, if that wasn't happening, could make mediation a lot more effective. In some other cases, we hear local authorities telling parents not to bother with mediation. Just take it to the tribunal, even though they've got a requirement to attend. If a parent requests mediation, some authorities are telling parents that they won't. So there's a real obvious barrier there. Other barriers in terms of mediation that we frequently hear of are things like local authorities not arranging the mediation session in time, in breach of Regulation 36, and then subsequently refusing to mediate at all. Refusing to mediate about the placement in EHC plans, Section I. So that's something that a parent doesn't need to have a mediation certificate if they were only to appeal Section I, but they still have a right to that, engage in that process. So while we've been doing a lot to try and raise awareness of that, some local authorities still seem to be misunderstanding that and kind of saying no to mediating. Others are offering informal meetings, and we would generally suggest, any opportunity to discuss things with your authority is an opportunity, but to offer some informal meeting and then, as happens, refuse to formally mediate is another problem that we're seeing. Your question was, I think, more specifically around at local authority level, but I do think this is an opportunity to draw attention to a process that's happening in the tribunal, which is judicial alternative dispute resolution. The tribunal has been trialling this for some time, only in relation to appeals around placement. But what we've heard at tribunal user group meetings at the end of last month was that in around 70% of the cases where they're employing this method are settling without the need for a hearing, so earlier. This is very different to mediation. So there's a specially trained judge who, in this process, can speak with each party separately, the local authority and the parent or their representative, and confidentially comment on the strengths and weaknesses of their case with reference to the law. So that's something that doesn't happen in mediation. And they'll then go on and kind of facilitate discussion between them. So as I said, the tribunal's reporting that this is a really successful approach. While it's only been used in appeals that are only about the placement, they have said that they're planning to trial that, trial extending it to different types of appeals in the summer. And what I would say, of course, is that if lawful decisions were made in the first instance, then a parent wouldn't need to consider taking any of these actions.
Thank you. Jess.
Thank you. Also to Georgina. The 2024 report towards an effective and financially sustainable approach to SEN in England, which was commissioned by the County Councils Network and the LGA, highlights that SEND tribunal rulings do not take into account the financial or resource constraints faced by local area partnerships. What steps could be taken to address this issue?
Well, firstly, I would say that it's actually wrong to say that the tribunal doesn't take into account financial constraints and resources. I know the report you're referring to did take that line, but that's not actually accurate. That report misrepresents how the tribunal makes decisions, especially around placements that are named in EHC plans. The tribunal's role, and the role of EHC plans, is not to give anyone more than they need. So children and young people are rightly entitled to provision which is reasonably required to meet their SEN, and to a placement which is suitable and appropriate for them, which wouldn't mean that the other children there didn't get an efficient education, and importantly for this question, wouldn't mean that it would be inefficient use of resources or unreasonable public expenditure. So the law and the tribunal that applies it does take into account financial resources. And in fact, the tribunal requires local authorities to provide evidence on costs, especially costs of placements, including from the schools or the settings themselves, to ensure accuracy. And local authorities have the opportunity throughout the appeal process to demonstrate it if they believe that a lawful exception around public expenditure or the use of their resources applies. And equally, if they believe that the provision that's being sought in the appeal would be more than is reasonably required. So we're fully aware, of course, and we've already talked about the significant financial pressures that local authorities are under, but we would refute any suggestion that an appropriate solution to this would be for the tribunal to base its decisions on anything other than the evidence and the existing law.
Thank you. This is a question for Sharon. A significant proportion of your complaints are relating to SEND. Do you think the accountability system for local area partnerships in relation to SEND is working well? And how could it be strengthened across education, health and local authorities?
I've already touched, obviously, upon the schools issue, so I won't repeat myself unless you require further clarification. I mean, from our perspective, it does work well in that we can hold local authorities to account, and we very robustly do. We're transparent in our work, so we publish all of our decisions. We've got an interactive map on our website that you can benchmark councils against each other, look at service improvements we've made, etc., etc. So there's lots of information available to councils who are struggling to sort of look at how others are achieving what they set out to do. What we try and do is not replicate work that is being undertaken elsewhere. So if we investigate a SEN case and we find fault causing injustice, we will look to see, is there a local action plan or an Ofsted action plan in place? Are those plans addressing the issues that we've identified? We may ask for an update on progress against those plans instead of recommending sort of specific action. But if we see cases where there is no action plan in place, we've issued 2 reports this year, for example, where there was significantly delayed annual reviews. So parents weren't getting the decision that engaged the appeal right, or if there was a decision to amend the plan, there was lengthy delay before the final plan with the updated provision was in place, meaning children were missing out. In both of those reports, there was no local action plan in place. So we've recommended they draw up an action plan, and that action plan is overseen by the relevant committee, and reports are put on the website for parents who are affected to see it. So we are creative in the way we sort of hold councils to account. We flagged the EP shortage back in early 2024. We issued a report highlighting the educational psychology issues, and at the time our press release was saying this is 10 years in the making. This could have been anticipated with the ever-increasing rise in EHCP needs requests and plans. It should have been foresawn that this was going to be an issue. We are robust about requiring evidence of compliance. We don't have binding powers, but our compliance rate is very high. It usually hovers around 99%. But we will take further action if we do see failures to comply, and that's usually registering a new case and considering reporting on it, which ensures that extra oversight and scrutiny. As I've said, I'll bang the drum again one more time, it could be strengthened by giving us schools as well. And And although we monitor and require evidence of compliance with our service improvement recommendations, we can't do that in the long term. We're simply not resourced. So we would really like to see Ofsted in their conversations with local authorities discussing what is the impact, what has the impact of these service improvement recommendations been. If there hasn't been an impact, why not? What is the issue? So if we could tighten that up, it would be good as well. And we could replicate all of that in schools. So.
I've just got a follow-up question. The local government and social care ombudsman can require local authorities to provide financial remedies in cases of failure. In your view, how effective are such financial penalties, and would expanding their use across the SEND accountability system help to strengthen it?
The way we operate our recommendations, including financial recommendations, is we're not punitive, and I know that's not popular with parents who see us less on. We have been accused of letting councils off lightly, but our aim is to try and improve systems on a wider basis for all. So we aim to put people back in the position they would have been in had the fault not occurred. Obviously, when you're talking about a child or a young person who's either been out of school for an extended period or hasn't had the provision that they're entitled to for an extended period, we simply can't do that. And in those sorts of circumstances, we do make symbolic financial recommendations. But our focus is very much, as I say, on the service improvements. So we're not about penalising, we're about working to make things right and improving things for a wider set of people. We're really keen to better understand the impact of those recommendations in SEND, and we're currently working with Manchester University on that specific point. It's research funded by the Nuffield Institute. Early signs are that the councils take our findings very seriously, particularly acknowledge and welcome our increasing focus on systemic failings. Even in the context of, a system under significant challenge, what we're being told is it can give extra leverage when additional resources are needed in a particular area. So given this, our view is financial penalties, increasing the use of those on a wider basis wouldn't necessarily drive improvements and could actually result in perverse behaviours to try and avoid those penalties. So recommendations around service change we feel are more effective, and we'll hopefully be in a position to further evidence that once the research has been completed by Manchester University. Thank you.
Darren.
Chair. My questions are for representatives from Ofsted and CQC. Can you say a bit about what your area SEND inspections tell us about the performance of local authorities in this area?
I'll start. Thank you for the question. We do find a very varied picture on the framework that we started in January 2023. So far, we've completed 64 inspections out of 153 local area partnerships. We've had around a third receiving an outcome of what we call widespread and systemic failings. Around half, so 48%, inconsistent experiences, and at 23%, typically positive experiences and outcomes. Really important that I clarify our focus is on how well the partnership in its entirety support and meet the needs of children and young people with SEND through their outcomes and experiences. And that's all children with SEND, so those that have an education, health and care plan, and those who are supported and are receiving SEN support as well. Some common issues that we find, if I talk to you about a few of those, are workforce pressures, sufficiency in the recruitment and retention of colleagues that work with children with special educational needs, a lack of coordination between health, social care and education partners, rising requests for both SEN support and then education and health and care plans, and also a variability in access to services, either due to a lack of sufficiency in services, possibly long waiting times or other aspects such as differences across the partnership geographically to where children, young people and families can access those services. We've also found strong examples out there as well in our inspections report, in every report, areas that do need further attention and at times specific areas of priority action that the Department for Education in NHS England will support and challenge that area once we leave. But also we identify good practice in all areas as well to drive further improvement. I don't know if Lucy
comes in to clarify, you're saying that 23%, so 1 in 4 local authorities satisfactorily meet the needs of children in their SEND provision.
So what we would say is that those children and young people, through our evidence, have typically positive experiences and outcomes. So when the team weighs up the evidence across the piece, so we're looking at health colleagues and their input, we're also looking at the partnership, how well parents and carers are communicated with, what are their opinions of the area as well. Once all of that evidence is weighed up, the team, which is highly professional and expert inspectors, weigh that evidence up and they form that outcome for the area, that typically positive experiences and outcomes for those children and young people.
Thanks for clarification. Lisa.
Yeah, and the other point I think to clarify on that is that under this inspection framework we haven't been to all local authority areas yet, or local area partnerships yet on the full SEND inspection. So that's only from the ones that we've been to so far. It's not the full 153. Yeah. I think the key points to highlight from our area SEND inspections where we have identified some typically positive experiences are some of that joint working, and I know that you've heard evidence from previous committees about the difference of really well co-produced strategic plans, good joint commissioning arrangements, and that is something that we've seen through the evidence in our area SEND inspection reports, and we do try to highlight that, and I think that they are key features of those typically positive reports. So just to reiterate about co-production and strategic co-production, the impact that can have on lots of the services, on understanding unintended consequences, but that involves the local area partnership really, truly and meaningfully engaging with children and families and some representative groups. I can read out one of the areas from a report that identifies some of that, or would you like we can write to you with that? It's in a published report. So
I think writing to us with something that's already published would be helpful.
Yeah, that's fine. We can do that and highlight that.
So on the revised framework that you both mentioned that came in 2023, very quickly, why was that necessary? What led to the revision of the framework?
Yeah, so our previous framework that we operated from 2016 to 2023 did have a focus on compliance. The Children and Families Act was relatively recently introduced. That inspection framework between 2016 and 2022 was commissioned as a one-off inspection programme. So Ofsted and CQC were, and actually at the start of that programme we were going in and doing an inspection, and at that point we didn't have the revisits even written into the framework. As we progressed through that framework, it became quite apparent that there were a number of areas where there were significant weaknesses. So under that framework, we asked local area partnerships to write a written statement of action. So we identified the significant weaknesses. We asked them to write a written statement of action. We then went back and inspected as Ofsted and CQC to assess only those points that were identified as significant weaknesses, to evaluate whether there was sufficient progress made. That was only commissioned as a one-off cycle of inspections. Our current inspection framework is a cycle of full area SEND inspections, all of which result in an outcome, and that outcome judgment then predicts the level of engagement from DfE and NHSE. And it also predicts Ofsted and CQC's subsequent inspection activity. The other important point to note about this framework as well is we have introduced a social care inspector into the inspection team. So under our 2016 to 2022 framework, it was Ofsted Education and CQC doing those inspections. It's been really valuable, the inspection teams, and I think you can see it in the published reports in terms of the evidence that we can report on, to have a social care inspector in those inspections. The other things just to point to and make people aware of under the current area SEND framework is we've also got thematic SEND inspections that focus on one part of the SEND system. So far we have published the alternative provision thematic, the preparation for adulthood thematic, and we are currently delivering a thematic that is children that are educated outside of school. We have also introduced engagement meetings, and those engagement meetings are used in between inspection activity they are delivered by Ofsted and CQC. The design of those engagement meetings is to try and keep a spotlight on SEND. They are conducted with the local area partnership. So it's a local area partnership that are around the table for those SEND engagement meetings. So there are a number, I think, to summarise your question, there are a number of features of this framework, that the current framework, that make the accountability processes more continuous, rather than in our previous framework, it was a one-off independent inspection.
And taken as a whole, all of those measures, is it your view that those changes have proven effective in improving the assessment process?
Thank you. I think that we will have more information about that once we start our monitoring visits that will start in due course. So we are currently completing a review of the current area SEND inspection framework. When we start our monitoring visits, I think we will have more information and more evidence to be able to answer that question. The other thing that I think will give us more information is the full inspections that follow on from the monitoring visit. So an area that is identified that has significant or systemic weaknesses, we will do a monitoring visit after around 18 months, but then we will also do a full inspection at 3 years. And there's a full inspection at 3 years for the areas where there are inconsistent findings. As inspectorates under that joint inspection framework, we are yet to do that, to deliver that activity. So I would anticipate that will give us more information about the impact of inspection and the impact of the intervention from either the local governance routes and the routes from DfE and NHSE.
Adam, is there anything you wanted to add?
I'd just build on Lucy's point about in the latest framework we include a social care inspector as well. And actually I think that because we inspect as a partnership, that naturally brings together the partners that we are inspecting, so that we have a lens on how well together those different services are working to support the children and young people we've sent in their area. And as Lucy says, we will be starting the monitoring visits in the summer term, and then we'll build a clearer sense about the impact that our work has had, especially on those areas that we've left with areas for priority action.
Fair to say that any further kind of improvements or changes to the framework will be happening after you've started the monitoring visits, or are there any kind of tweaks or changes that you're planning to make at this stage?
We're currently reviewing the Area SEND framework, which was a commitment by Ofsted following our big listen. We've been working with the Department for Education, NHS England, stakeholders in the sector as well. We'll publish that in due course, and I will write to the committee. What that will clarify is our approach to monitoring inspections, so that they're clearer for the sector about what they will entail. And we've also focused on there, for example, in how we will strengthen the voice of parents and carers, and clarified our approach to engagement meetings as well, to make that inspection package more robust.
Thank you, Chair. My question is for Adam. Adam, Lincolnshire, where my constituency is, the SEND services have been rated outstanding, which, from what you've said, is quite an unusually good rating for across the country. So what is it that you're doing to ensure that other counties and other areas can learn from where Lincolnshire is doing things well? Now, Lincolnshire was also commended for the strong leadership and commitment to improve outcome for children and families, and leadership has changed as a result of recent elections. So what do Ofsted do when leadership changes in terms of their inspection regime? Because having an outstanding rating may mean you get inspected less frequently, but if the leadership has changed at that county since then, does that mean you go more frequently after that?
Thank you for the question. So in Area Send, we don't have the same judgments that are made on, for example, our ILACS inspection, which currently mirrors schools. So, for example, outstanding, good, requires improvement, and inadequate. So what we're doing, though, to promote positive outcomes and experiences is those reports are published to the sector. We also summarise findings, and will we be doing so in our Area Send review. So some typical positive strengths that we identify that other areas can use. Of course, they can't pick those up and drop them into their locality. They need to think about how that will work for their context in detail. But we also drive change through thematic visits as well that Lucy has touched on. So, for example, in alternative provision, we found areas that needed to be strengthened, but also areas that were better able to commission those alternative provision placements for children. And so there's a natural ability for areas to use our work in the widest sense to drive change. Your second part of the question, which was about change in leadership, on this cycle we have, so after 5 years we will return. Where there are leadership changes, first of all, we always recognise and discuss that when the notification takes place, and that is reported on for the public to see on the front page of the report. So that might clarify the newness of a team or stability in a team. We wouldn't naturally draw conclusions from that, but wherever there was a specific, perhaps an increase in a number of complaints or other regional intelligence, which would come to either Ofsted or to CQC, we could act and either call an engagement meeting to call leaders to discuss with us what's happening in their area, or if there were significant concerns, we do have the right to inspect a provider. Thank you.
Thank you. My question will be to Lucy, Harte and Adam Sproston. So really good to see you today. We know that Ombudsmen find fault in their investigations in 92% of cases, and that tribunals find in favour of parents in 95% of cases. And IPSEA suggests that your area inspections have failed to take a rigorous approach to monitoring local area compliance with the law. They've suggested, therefore, that area send inspections should include and consider including metrics such as tribunal outcomes, upheld ombudsman complaints or judicial reviews. What's your response to these proposals?
Yeah, Georgina, thank you.
Thank you. We, as set out in our framework, we do consider a wide range of data at the start of the inspection process, and that does include tribunal data. That is used as a starting point on inspection, and we don't check compliance with every legal duty on our inspections, but we are evaluating the experiences and outcomes of children and young people with SEND. Through our training, we do discuss with inspectors that is something that must be discussed on inspection, and it may mean that they do find more significant concerns in the area. What we focus on the ground in local area partnership inspections is what leaders and the partnership know about perhaps increases in complaints, tribunals, for example, but more importantly, that driver on, well, what are they doing about it? Who are they bringing in? And vitally important, how are they involving parents and carers in that process? A typical example, I suppose, is the timeliness of education, health and care plans, and we do routinely identify that as an area for priority action or an area for improvement. But we always seek to explore what leaders are doing about that. Is there a particular blocker in the system, such as a shortage of particular specialists? And importantly, if parents and carers being informed about what will be in place while they are waiting. We're not excusing anything there, but we consider the whole area and also the outcomes on children and young people and how people feel about the process, how well they're used in co-production to come up with solutions jointly. Anything to add, Lucy?
Yeah, I think that data is a really important it's a really important starting point for the inspection team when we ask for information from the local area, and it includes the data on tribunals. It's a really important starting point for the inspection team. They start to develop their lines of inquiry from that, but this inspection framework is looking at the experiences and outcomes. What we do through our reports is try to bring to life more than the data point. So the experiences, like before they get to that mediation or tribunal point. And I think some of the data as well that we've spoken about here in the committee highlights the importance of that, because not all children in the current accountability system with SEND would have access to that mediation because they haven't met the threshold for an EHCP assessment. So there's something, I know, Georgina, you mentioned at the start about the importance of thinking about statutory responsibilities for children and young people who access SEN support. And our current inspection framework attempts to evaluate the experiences of all children and young people with SEND, not just those with EHCPs, even though, as Adam's already said, we do identify significant local area partnership challenges with EHCPs. But it's really important that we use the data, we triangulate that through our inspection activity and report on the evaluation criteria that's set out in the handbook and framework. So the data is important, but for the purposes of this inspection framework, it's one part of the person's lived experience.
And I suppose building on that more broadly, to what extent is legal compliance, and you've touched on this a bit, but it would be helpful if you could be more explicit, is legal compliance currently factored into the area inspections?
I'll go. So inspectors consider complaints that have come through, upheld cases as part of the pre-inspection information that is gathered, and that is considered typically through themes. So there might be a theme of timeliness, there might be a theme that certain services aren't provided, and then that draws key lines of inquiry that are then tested out through other inspection activity. For example, gathering first-hand evidence from parents and carers, children and young people, speaking to a range of staff and leaders that are working on the front line to support children and young people with SEND. So legal compliance data, I suppose, is considered. As I said earlier, we don't check each legal compliance, but it is factored into our inspection information. I think it's important to say as well, as data is only the starting point, there isn't data as such, which is why we need well-skilled inspectors on the ground to look at quality. Sorry, Maria.
I think the thing that I really want to push you on is not just talking about the data. You've very helpfully set out your methodology and how you triangulate the information and essentially listening to children and young people and their parents who don't get access to the legal system, but they therefore will nevertheless give you a reflection of the extent to which compliance is happening in practice. So I'm just trying to get at, for those groups which you've eloquently set out, we need to get at, as well as the data, where you're not seeing compliance for those individuals, how you're reflecting that in your findings.
So where? Yes, sorry. Yeah.
I think that so Adam touched on it earlier in talking about when we identify that through our inspection activity. Part of our inspection activity as well, and part of the evaluation criteria, is the leadership and governance processes. So how that might be borne out on inspection, or how that is borne out on inspection, is how the inspection team can be assured through their evidence base that the leadership has taken account of the evidence that is reflected through the area send inspection. So whether that be that there are significant concerns about some area of compliance, like Adam said, we wouldn't go through every single area of compliance, but where that came up as a theme, where that compliance came up as an issue, that would then be further explored by the inspection team with the leaders in the local area, so that the inspection team can really understand the lived experience, and that is then how it would be reported in that final full inspection report. That would be the process that information would go through on inspection, and how it would land in the final inspection report.
Thank you. And just one final follow-up from me. What factors, in your view, would close the compliance gap? And given that we know there's 59 million spent on legal proceedings, with 46 million spent by local authorities, 13 million spent by DfE, how could that money be moved further upstream to be distributed differently?
I think it comes back to the focus on ensuring that partners are around the table. So when there are early signs of difficulties or challenges that are faced by children, young people and families, that there are quick systems to discuss challenges in a face-to-face way in order to mitigate them, to stop an escalation. The point about money wouldn't be a matter for us to comment on. However, in our preparation for adulthood thematic, what we did find is, of course, when early intervention is in place and resources in areas are focusing on children and young people that may need different, accommodation when they're older, or other support, when that is put in place earlier, it typically does have a better focus on how everybody feels about the system, but also on improving their outcomes and experiences.
And would Lucy? Sorry. Go ahead.
Lucy first.
No, I was just going to highlight, I think there is probably some good examples, and maybe we can include that in some follow-up written evidence. We can share that from some published reports, because I think that there are some really good examples of where we've seen some significant weaknesses on inspection in regards to education, health and care plans, and thinking about the compliance element for that is about the timeliness, but what we see on inspection is significant concerns about not only the timeliness but also then the quality, how those education and healthcare plans are co-produced, and the quality of annual reviews. So I think there is more in the inspection reports that might help to illustrate some of that, and we can pick that out from our inspection reports, if you like.
Thank you. So, Georgina,
sorry, yes, I just wanted to chip in on, obviously you asked a question around legal compliance, which was sort of based on, I think, our written evidence from IPSEA. So I just wanted to elaborate slightly. While it is positive to hear what you've been saying about the data and things that you do consider, it's our view that it's not just about leadership, but local authority, ICB leaders, school leaders, yes, absolutely, need to have an understanding and be applying the law, but so does everyone that works for them. And the data that I'm sure you're seeing, but also that is publicly available, the Ombudsman decisions, etc., all show that we can't assume that there is an understanding and there is compliance with the legal framework in terms of the Children and Families Act. So it's our view that that breaches of those duties should form part of a more significant part of these inspections and should count as significant weaknesses that require oversight and action. And absolutely, data from complaints, tribunal appeals, ombudsman complaints, etc., is important, but that does rely on families having the knowledge the ability, the time, and making the effort on top of everything else that they're dealing with to actually initiate those processes. So we see an opportunity in the area send inspection framework for it to cover looking at compliance, which doesn't rely or put the onus on parents to be taking those actions in the first place.
I'm going to go to Manuela.
Thank you, Chair. My question is to Adam. So, Adam, you have mentioned that you want to incorporate parents and carers of children's and young people's voices into area send inspection and Ofsted school inspection. So how are you ensuring that these voices are heard rather than just being a tick box exercise?
Thank you. We are completely committed to ensuring that children, young people and families' voices are part of all of our inspection work. And to answer your question, I'll start first of all with Area Send and then I'll move on to schools if that's okay. So in Area Send, we speak face-to-face with parents and carers. We engage with the Parent Carer Forum. There is one of those in each local area partnership. We have always sent a survey to parents and we have had a huge response rate since January 2023 of around 80,000. I can send the exact figure through. So around 81,000 responses to our survey. That also brings through key findings that the inspection team can test out further, threads that they may want to unpick a little bit further, and reflect what parents are saying to us on inspection. I think as part of the framework as well, it's vitally important that we do see parents and carers as part of the partnership. So in all that we do, when we speak about individual children's education, health and care plans, we're triangulating the work that we do on the ground with parents and carers. So for example, did you know about this package of support that's gone in? How did you get to this point? And we talk closely with families as well. I'll hand to Lucy and then I promise I will come back to you about the question about schools. Have you got anything to add there, Lucy, about Area Send?
I think the voice of children and families on under this current framework on the Area Send inspection is front-loaded at the start of the inspection. So the inspection survey goes live on the day of the day of the announcement, shared the following day actually after announcement. And the analysis from that survey, the survey's live for a week. The analysis from that survey is then shared with the inspection team. So the inspection team have got access to the raw data, but they've also can have an analysis to pick out those themes. And that means Adam shared the overall numbers, but we have, when you drill down to the individual inspections, we've had a really good response rate on the inspections. And having the children, one element of the children and family voice at that point in the inspection allows the inspection team to develop their lines of inquiry, not only based on the data, but also on children and families' voice in a way that we wouldn't be able to, that would be really difficult to replicate those numbers and achieve that reach and coverage. There is a separate questionnaire for children and young people as well to complete, as well as parents and carers. The other element that it allows the inspection team to do is it's an anonymous survey, but it allows the inspection team to look at particular geographical hotspots, because people are asked to submit their postcode, so we can really see in some of the larger shire counties that there might be some challenges in different geographical pockets, and so it means inspection activity and lines of inquiry can be focused towards maybe some unanswered questions that the survey does pose. We also have a case tracking methodology as well on the Area Send inspection, and that means that we understand so a smaller number of children and young people's experiences in depth. That involves speaking to the children and families where they would like to speak with us. We wouldn't force anybody to do that. And then as we move through the inspection activity, there are other points of engagement with children and families. And part of the Area Send review that we can't share the details yet, but part of the Area Send review is Ofsted and CQC considering how we use parent voice. So it's really, really important part of these inspections. And when we launched the inspection framework, we were really clear that this was about children and families' voices being at the heart from the start of the inspection activity, and the inspection methodology reflects that approach. Thanks, Adam.
You've just reminded me of something else. If I can just build on that a little bit more, and I'll turn to schools following that, is that the survey was developed with the parent-carer forum as well. You know, we've got an easy read version so that the survey is accessible, and we've worked with parents and carers during the current area SEND review. With regards to your question about schools, parents and carers' opinions are at the heart of what we do. We have a tool that is used, an online survey that parents and carers can fill out at any time of the year. And that's also announced to parents at the point of notification, and that's called the Ofsted Parent View tool. That information then goes to the lead inspector, who will then draw from that as one piece of evidence again anything that they may want to test out alongside leaders and working with their inspection team on the ground. We also consider any complaints that are received, and they get saved as part of pre-inspection information. Again, I will write to you with specific details, but around a fifth of our complaints to Ofsted contain some element of SEND, either in its entirety or SEND is mentioned as part of the complaint. So that is all considered at the point of inspection. When there are particularly low rates of response, inspectors will seek to gather first-hand experience of parents and carers. For example, at the start of the school day, they will attempt to meet with inspectors, with parents and carers at the school gate.
Okay, so I'm now going to move the similar question to Georgina. So from an IPSEA experience and expertise, is parental engagement adequately embedded across SEND accountability processes? And what further steps could be taken to strengthen parental voices and carers' voices and involvement so their feedback is valued and acted upon?
So, despite some of the things you've got in place, which are certainly positive, what we hear from parents is that they are dissatisfied with their opportunity to contribute to inspections and can feel that their views get overlooked. So I don't know if there's anything in sort of, it's absolutely excellent to start with their views, but I don't know if there's anything beyond surveys and those sort of on-the-spot attempts to meet with people at the school gates that could be employed to improve that. Certainly, parents and carers' views need to be properly listened to. I'm not going to apologise for mentioning the law again, but parents do expect the law to be followed. So when it isn't, and then that doesn't feature as something that is thoroughly scrutinised in these inspections, that's something that can contribute to them not feeling heard or their voices not being valued as well.
Okay, thank you.
Darren.
Thank you. So, interested as to how Ofsted's proposed inspection framework really strengthens schools' accountability for including pupils with SEND. Obviously, you've set out a kind of definition of what inclusion looks like, but there is concern, of course, that you could say some very, there's some really unimpeachable values in there. There's some stuff that we would all agree with. But is anything going to change in terms of the traditional metrics that form those decisions? So could you say something about how that's going to really improve the accountability around inclusion and really take it seriously?
Thank you. So we've recently ended a 12-week consultation period on our proposed new education frameworks. And they will run from early years schools and through to further education and skills providers. We're pleased to have had over 6,500 responses, and we are detailing that we're going to analyse those in detail. And when able to share the details, but wouldn't want to preempt the result of that today, but can share conclusions in due course. What I will do is discuss how we've formed that definition of inclusion, and that's what we're going to be considering alongside the responses from the consultation. So, importantly, when our Chief Inspector, Sir Martin Oliver, came to the committee in January, he talked about how if you get it right for the most disadvantaged children, you get it right for all, and that is thoroughly what we believe at Ofsted. So there will be a laser-like focus on children with SEND in our proposals going forward. Importantly, children and young people in the Big Listen ranked the support for their friends and their peers with SEND as one of their top priorities. So that is something we have listened and heard and are going to put forward in what we're going to be announcing. We're going to have an inclusion evaluation area, and the definition that we formed around that, so a way of considering inclusion in our work, was formed with stakeholder engagement, and we have established an external reference group that has colleagues from multi-academy trusts on it, special school leaders, colleagues from the charitable sector as well, that have given us support and challenge on forming that definition. And as part of our consultation, we have asked for opinions on the definition, and we will take all of those responses into account when we produce our response.
Okay, so from here on, you are going to be ensuring that definition is reconsidered, to make sure it's robust, and importantly, I want to ask about, that it's capable of being meaningfully measured in inspections. You have a plan for that?
Yes, so we'll announce in due course our proposal, our response following our proposals. I can assure you that children with SEND will be at the heart of what we are looking at in the accountability system for the purposes of this committee, and the definition as a way of working is also being considered, and our response will be made following our analysis of those stakeholder views.
Can I come to Georgina and Sharon on this, just to get your view on whether the new inspection framework really reflects a comprehensive approach to SEND, or whether you think there's any further ways that it could be strengthened?
Yeah. I mean, I will come back to my point again that it could be strengthened by having proper accountability underpinning it. Mm-hmm. So it's as you say, it reads well. We've got no objections to the definition, but if a parent is saying that a school has not removed the barriers, my child is not achieving and thriving, they've got nowhere to go with that. So to make it stronger, make sure there is a complaint route for parents that's easy, accessible and independent.
Just to touch on that particular point before talking about the definition of inclusion, our experience at IPSEA is that when parents complain to the Department for Education about a school, that the department has wide discretion over what it will and won't investigate, and it doesn't have the powers that the Ombudsman has. It doesn't publish complaints results, and it doesn't have or issue recommendations for financial remedies. So again, IPSEA supports the Ombudsman's extension of their jurisdiction to cover schools, and there's just a couple of reasons additionally to what's been mentioned about that. In terms of the inspection framework and the introduction of inclusion, that's a positive step to have that as an evaluation criteria. In terms of the definition, it's our view that it's quite top level, and it does include some subjective terms like high expectations, which might be open to interpretation between a school and an inspector. So we do think some of those things need to be pinned down as far as possible to kind of avoid confusion. We'd say that key factors need to include training and support for school staff on inclusive practices, expecting school leaders to implement inclusive policies, and having strong systems for collecting and analysing data, and things like looking at flexibility in the delivery of the curriculum and things along those lines. And unsurprisingly, we consider the inspection framework and the inclusion within it to be an opportunity to assess the extent to which settings, schools are complying with their existing legal duties to be inclusive, and the Children and Families Act and the Equality Act, of course, as well. So we think the inspection toolkit should refer to that. The version that's been consulted on doesn't. It refers to the SEND Code of Practice, but that's not the same as the primary legal duties. And there are a couple of those duties that, in our experience, are frequently being breached. So this could be an accountability mechanism to help avoid that. For example, the duty on mainstream schools to include children with special educational needs in the activities of the school with children who don't have those needs. That's a legal duty in Section 35 of the Children and Families Act, subject to some limited exceptions. But we know from calls to our helplines that it's not happening, and that children with SEND are frequently excluded from the activities of the school, things like clubs and school trips, PE, and even from the classroom itself, for reasons that aren't covered by those exceptions, and seem to be sometimes, and remember, people come to IPSEA when things aren't going right, but the reasons that seem to be given seem to relate more to the school's convenience or maybe an excessively cautious approach to risk. But that's not inclusion, people not being able to mix with children who don't have SEN, nor is being directed off-site or excluded for behaviour that's arisen due to unmet needs or disability, or even being full-time in a specially resourced provision or an SEN unit. There's been quite a bit of interest in recently. The provision made in those units can certainly be really valuable, but if someone is spending more time than they want, and more time is required to meet their needs in there and prevented from mixing with other children at school, then that's not inclusion. So we think that the framework could be strengthened if things like this in terms of legal duties were being looked at, and familiarity and compliance with the Equality Act, schools understanding and not treating pupils unfavourably because of their disability or something arising from a disability, and having a willingness to make reasonable adjustments. That's all vitally important. And if inspections were looking at that, that would be valuable, especially things like the anticipatory duty to be making adjustments to avoid disabled children being disadvantaged. And as we've talked about already, disability discrimination claims, complaints, that can be helpful information for informing an inspection view. So we think the definition of inclusion and the toolkit should incorporate some of these legal duties, and that would strengthen accountability for schools to be truly inclusive and be a significant improvement to the way that the framework's currently written.
Okay, so if I've heard you right, it does strengthen some of the school accountability, but there are a number of further measures that you've talked about. Which would be,
I think, help be specific around some of the legal duties. And while it's certainly really crucial to have inclusion as an evaluation criteria in its own right, we also think that should underpin other areas of evaluation as well. So like the area of attendance, for example, a key measure of inclusivity here would be how many children and which children are missing from school, not through choice, not through parents choosing to home educate, but are not receiving an education, or who have been excluded from school. So there's data that could be gathered on that and could be published alongside school report cards, so sort of by school. Things like, in addition to the children who are missing from education, those who are on a part-time timetable or who have been excluded, whether that's formally, permanently, or temporarily. So we think the description for what is seen as causing concern should make explicit reference to these things, to pupils who are persistently absent, to whether their needs are being met. And if someone is not attending regularly, whether there's been any investigation or assessment of any needs that they might have that might relate to that. So that's just one example. Attendance and inclusion go hand in hand. We often hear of child's needs being unmet or misunderstood being the reason that they're not in school. So we see an opportunity for this framework to be looking at that through the lens of inclusion, not treating attendance, behaviour and things like that as separate issues.
Thank you.
Hello.
Thank you. So my first question is also to Georgina. The National Association for Special Educational Needs has said that school inspection should take account of exclusion rates of SEND children, attendance patterns of SEND children, levels of co-production and outcomes beyond the classroom that prepare SEND children for adulthood. Would you agree with this?
Yes, I think hopefully what I just said effectively answers that, but certainly, yes, I wouldn't have anything to add.
Okay, we've been through that quite thoroughly, so we'll move on. So my next question is to Sharon and then anyone else who wants to contribute. Concerns have been raised here with the committee during this inquiry about a lack of robust scrutiny of SEND provision in academies and free schools. Do you agree with these concerns, and what action would you recommend? And I think you did reference that at the beginning, but maybe you'd like to elaborate a little bit.
I mean, absolutely academies and free schools, but also maintained schools as well. Enable us to look at the SEND support, those children who fall below that threshold. Enable us to look at the omissions, the exclusions, and accountability will follow. We're regularly seeing councils really struggling with children who've been excluded, maybe for behavioural issues, etc. Really struggling to find alternative placements and not being able to obviously direct into academies, even when the fair access protocols apply. Now, there's probably lots of good practice. We don't see it. We only sort of see where things have gone wrong. But yeah, we would fully support additional scrutiny for free schools, academies and maintained schools as well.
Maybe I could ask you, Adam, do you think that's something that's coming down the pipe? Is it likely to happen?
I think something that we welcome is in the King's Speech, the government announced about us having powers to look and inspect directly multi-academy trusts. So they do have responsibilities for children with SEND and other aspects of a school's work, but we don't directly inspect a trust level currently. So that is something that we would welcome.
And have you had any indication that you might be given it?
I haven't. No, I haven't, but I will check and I will write back if that is different.
Thank you. Manuela.
Thank you. My first question is to Sharon. Your call last year for expanded powers to investigate the implementation of education, health and care plans and the provision of CN support in schools reflects growing concerns, which we heard as well, about accountability within schools. Could you explain the rationale behind this request and why it is considered urgent?
I won't repeat what I've already said because obviously I've gone into it in quite a lot of detail, but obviously I'll provide any clarification needed. I mean, we do feel it's an urgent issue. We think the lack of accountability, situations drift, children and young people are left without the provision they're entitled to, as you've heard from Georgina. That is an escalating issue and it costs the country more in the end because they need the additional support further down the line. It creates all sorts of issues in myriad ways when children and young people aren't supported correctly. So we feel there's been lots of opportunities to fill this gap. We've asked for it several times. This committee has recommended it previously. Back in 2014, we were saying there is a gap, but it didn't get filled. We would like to see, as I say, true accountability across all the education spectrum.
Thank you. And my next question is to Georgina. You already mentioned that one of your recommendations is to make C&D support statutory. And obviously there are differing perspectives on whether this should be made statutory. In your view, would this improve accountability in schools? And also, what would be required to implement it effectively?
Okay. Yeah, so we hear of schools and local authorities interpreting existing duties to children and young people with SEN who don't have EHC plans. So that's, for those who don't know, those for whom SEN support is relevant, interpreting those duties differently, and quite often then a child falls through the gap. So when I say duties, what I mean is the duties of mainstream schools, colleges and maintained nursery schools to use, quote, their best endeavours to secure the special educational provision that a child or a pupil or student on their roll needs. In other words, that means to do what they reasonably can to meet their SEN. And also they have a duty to have regard to the SEND Code of Practice and what it says about SEN support, which, as statutory guidance, is something that settings could depart from as long as they had a good reason to. So these different interpretations that we see reflect how current duties around SEN support lack clarity and, if necessary, are difficult to enforce. So they're not as strong and clear-cut as if the law required settings to take particular steps to identify and meet and support children and young people who don't have EHC plans but do have SEN, so far as they are able to. And that's important because we need to ensure that we're not expecting schools to do things that they don't have the resources or the expertise available for. So in terms of the why, I can speak a bit more to that. So in February, IPSEA and the organisation Contact surveyed 2,000 families of children and young people who have SEN but don't have education, health and care plans. And the results of that survey indicate that lacking SEN support resulted in absence, part-time timetables and exclusions. And of the families who completed the survey, a fifth of children with SEN were not getting any SEN support, so not getting any support from their school. And the high exclusion rates for children who are on SEN support, I'd have to check, but I think they're around 4 times more likely to be excluded from school than those who don't have SEN. And also what we hear from people using IPSEA services indicates that some schools are not following the code, probably not following the law and the statutory guidance on exclusions either. But if SEN support was statutory, it would then make duties to support rather than exclude these children stronger as well and clearer. So you asked about how this could be done. Well, since IPSEA submitted our written evidence, we have worked on draft proposed provision, which we would propose replaces the best endeavours duty and introduces clear requirements for supporting those who don't have EHC plans. And I can provide a copy of that to the committee after the session. But in summary, what we propose would require a mainstream setting, always in consultation with parents, to identify a child and young person's special educational needs and the special educational provision that they require, so far as they're able to from within their resources and expertise. Then to set this out in a prescribed SEN support plan, which would also specify any special educational needs that the child or young person might have but the school's been unable to fully identify, and make clear the provision that's required for them that the school can and cannot make from within their own resources. And then what we propose would require those settings to secure the special educational provision that they themselves have identified as being able to secure, and to notify the local authority of any provision that it cannot secure, as well as any needs or provision that it couldn't fully identify and why. So our suggestion is that this would be included within Section 66 of the Children and Families Act, so it would be a statutory duty. And the details of timescales and review, because we know if you're familiar with the SEN Code of Practice, it talks about assess, plan, do, review. Those sorts of details would be for regulations to cover. But the duties that we were proposing would support early intervention, which can make a long-term difference, of course, and also inclusive practice. Settings would need ring-fenced adequate funding if they were to be expected to put provision in place, rather than the notional per pupil SEN budget, which in reality is not and often cannot be applied to a particular individual, and also adequate ongoing and initial training. And on the funding point, our survey with Contact, 35% of the respondents to that survey said that the reason school gave for not providing SEN support or adequate SEN support was due to funding. We could share some more information from that survey as well, if it would be helpful. But just to be clear, IPSEA's view is SEN support should be made statutory. That would mean clear steps being set out in law that make it easier for schools and parents and others to understand what is expected for those who don't have education, health and care plans. But making SEN support statutory must not mean or involve in any way expecting educational settings to do more than their funding or their expertise allow. When that's the case, the threshold for an education, health and care needs assessment would be met, and that threshold and the threshold for issuing an EHC plan should not change. Linking it back to accountability, breach of a clear and specific statutory or legal duty is much easier to notice, to understand, and if necessary then enforce, than using your best endeavours, sort of doing what you can duty and complying with statutory guidance. So again, we would support the extension of the Ombudsman's remit, because if that was together with the introduction of statutory SEN support, that would strengthen accountability for those children and young people who don't have EHC plans. And the Ombudsman would be a more accessible route and less adversarial route than the alternative of possibly a judicial review against a public body for not complying with the legal duty when there's no other way of resolving that dispute quickly and effectively enough. Okay.
Caroline.
Thank you. So this question is to Adam. The committee has heard that accountability pressures can lead to exclusionary practice. What improvements and safeguards will be implemented through the new inspection framework to ensure that accountability measures instead promote inclusive approaches that support the needs of students with SEND?
Thank you. So Ofsted has long been committed to tackling off-rolling and any other exclusionary practices, such as gaming, for example, where something's done not in the best interests of the child, and that might be them not taking certain curriculum pathways or sitting certain exams. Not to go over the point again, but
Well, we can carry on. We don't need to do anything. It will go again in 3 minutes as well.
Although data does form a starting point, and we do have colleagues in our data and insights team that identify any possible patterns in pupils' attendance that may alert inspectors to possible off-rolling or concerns with attendance at the school, we will always explore those with leaders on the ground. What we are ultimately committed to in the handbook is that if we do find exclusionary practices, off-rolling or gaming for whatever reason, there will be consequences to the school. And that might be the inappropriate use of part-time timetables, the inappropriate use of alternative provision that we recognise does affect children and young people with SEND more than their non-SEND peers. The other aspect to consider is the first-hand inspection activity that takes place and how we would find out about this. And so pupils would tell us, or parents would talk to us during the inspection. I also want to recognise as well that we do look at a system level, so area SEND inspections, how children's placements have been commissioned, for example, alternative provision and the oversight that the local area has on schools' use of perhaps something that may be from off-rolling or not done quite in the best interests of children, and what oversight they have of what's going on in particular schools in their area. Something to link actually to Georgina's point that was raised earlier. We are concerned about the number of children that are on part-time timetables or have different ways of being educated, and we have launched with CQC a thematic inspection which is looking at children with SEND who are not in school. And that is exploring in detail, it's ongoing at the moment, but across a range of 6 local area partnerships of different contexts, what are the push and pull factors that have led to children not being educated in a school. And that will link to some of...
You're concerned about part-time timetables for what reason?
So there is an increase in part-time timetables, and we want to hear from parents and carers about why they are being used more. We also want to find out about their experiences of these, and linking it to your earlier question, whether that was done in the best interest or if they're being used to plug gaps in the system. And the same can be said about alternative provision. Sorry.
Presumably, if a part-time timetable was being used to encourage a child to come into school for a few hours rather than being not coming in at all, surely that's not something that Ofsted would
If that was the case, we would be pleased. This information is still being gathered, and we will pull together a report. But in some cases, and we found this on area send inspections, they're not always used, and children can stay on them for too long. And we believe that what you've just described, where they're used best, is to increase pupils' attendance at school over time in a well-managed way, working with parents and carers.
I would just echo that what we're hearing of is part-time timetables used in a way that's unlawful, in a way perhaps for the school to potentially a school would consider that it's a way of managing a situation, but actually it might mean that a child is being prevented from accessing their education because there are needs that they have that the school doesn't feel able to meet or hasn't understood. So every child of compulsory school age has a right to a suitable full-time education. And when they're on the roll of the school and you tell the local authority that they're not getting that, whilst being on the roll of a school doesn't prevent the local authority from having an obligation to fill that gap when a child's not otherwise receiving their education. Quite often there becomes a bit of a dispute around whose responsibility it is to make sure that that child who's not in school still gets education. And when we look at that in detail, in a lot of cases, what we see is that child could be in school. They don't need to be on a part-time timetable if the right resources and expertise had been put in place and their needs had been identified. So that right to a full-time education is subject to the exception of when it's in their best interests, as you say. So sometimes a part-time timetable might be in place with agreement of the parents to help with the situation you described, but more commonly we hear of them being used in a way that isn't supportive of meeting children's needs.
Okay. And could I just come in on that as well? And it's great to hear that schools are held to account when they're using inappropriate part-time timetables or off-rolling or unofficially excluding. But that doesn't mean there's any redress for those individuals who've been affected. And so they're left without any form of redress in those circumstances.
Okay, and just lastly, Georgina, you have touched on this previously, but maybe you could just sort of summarise what changes you think are needed to ensure that accountability measures discourage exclusionary practice and instead promote inclusive approaches.
So we certainly, in terms of schools, believe that the Ombudsman's jurisdiction should be extended, and its ability to strengthen accountability would be further strengthened by SEN support being made statutory. And also, we're talking about that from the perspective of steps within the accountability system needing to have been taken, but we hope that these things would actually mean that schools would have a clearer understanding and not be taking action that then leads to a complaint that ends up at the Ombudsman. But ultimately, schools have duties to be inclusive and shouldn't require encouragement to comply with them. And I'd question in what other area it would be considered acceptable to be talking about sort of persuading or encouraging someone to comply with their legal duties.
Caroline?
Thank you. It is really short. You talked about exclusions, part-time timetables, alternative provision of resources being used. Could that be considered a reflection of inadequate resources? I met some head teachers recently who talked about the behaviour challenges for the whole class, and they have a duty to the child with special needs. They also have a duty to the rest of the class. And they talked about how if they had a 2-to-1 arrangement with support for children and a child was not regulating their behaviour well, they would then be forced to take that child out of the classroom, leaving the rest of the class short of staff, essentially. And so are teachers doing the best for a whole cohort? And what can the inspection regime do to give leverage to the head teachers to get more resources for children where the resources that are provided are not enough for them to manage the whole cohort of children in their class?
So we wouldn't discuss resources with leaders necessarily. What we would do on inspection is consider local area inspection outcomes, and so if they are working in an area, for example, we may highlight lengthy wait times for certain health services. We will seek to explore that on the inspection, what is in place.
Look at the effect on the other children, I think, is a quite big part of the question.
We always consider all children, but if you mean the effect of an individual child on a wider cohort, is that? what you're referring to.
Yeah, I mean, what the head teachers are saying to me is that if they don't have adequate resources to manage a particular child within the classroom as they're required to, they're caught in a catch-22 situation, whereas if they bring the child into the classroom and try and manage them with inadequate resources, the whole class potentially does not achieve their best outcomes. If they bring the child into an alternative provision, they may be able to better manage that, and it may not be a very good situation either. Neither is a good situation, but that may be what may be done with the best of intention for the wider cohort. Do you look at that?
We look across the whole school and what the effect is on all learners, but we are focused on the children with SEND receiving the support that they need to thrive, and that's both in learning and in their well-being. I would say about alternative provision that we do find that is used too often as a place that children stay in for too long, as opposed to being a fixed term intervention, and how effectively that is used by schools is variable.
Move us on if that's okay to Serena.
Okay, thank you, Chair. So this question is for Adam and Georgina. The committee have received quite a lot of evidence from teachers and school leaders and SENCOs that Ofsted should consider excluding the achievement data of pupils we send and scrutinising data on the exclusions and admissions of children we send. Are these metrics being considered by Ofsted? If not, why?
Thank you. The metrics are considered by Ofsted. If I take the second one first, the exclusions and attendance, inspectors have robust evidence, pre-inspection information that comes through that can lead to, again, some lines of inquiry that will be unpicked further with leaders. That will, if it's a significant group, highlight individual cohorts, for example, children and young people with SEND, that the inspection team will seek to explore further and see what leaders are doing about that. There is always a focus on inspection, on improving attendance, and that's been particularly a focus of ours since the pandemic. And we do find that children with SEND, and have reported on this, are more likely, as I discussed earlier, to be on flexible timetables or not attend school, which is why we are exploring children not in school. Your first point was about data and how that's used on inspection, and that is really important that we do have data as a starting point to see how well children achieve. That is only part of the picture, and is why we have established the Ofsted Academy to improve inspector training, recruitment and retention, because for some children with SEND, they will not sit formal qualification pathways, and so it's important that we work with leaders to think about children's starting points and how they're developing, for example, preparation for adulthood or life skills through the curriculum that's offered. I acknowledge the point about data. We believe that is an important starting point that we will test further on inspection, because leaders and schools need to have high ambitions for children and young people with SEND.
Okay, now I believe that was a similar sentiment in the Ofsted Big Lesson. So how can you assure schools that they're not going to be penalised for pupils we send and their academic outcomes, but in fact focus more on the support and the progress that the child is making that's individual to them?
Yeah, so the current inspection handbook does clarify our approach to that, and that is working closely with leaders, mostly the special educational needs coordinator, to think about individual pupil starting points. And here, just to be really clear, we are talking about children who might follow a different curriculum pathway or not sit GCSE exams, or they might be on pathways that we don't have data on until we talk to the school, such as some qualifications that are modular that children can build up over time. We work to find out about children's starting points, talk to leaders about that, what's being put in place in terms of support and guidance for the child. And again, if there's something that's different to mainstream peers, our inspectors will seek to explore why that decision has been made and what the end point proposed for the child is. Of course, we're always thinking about how parents and other professionals have been involved in those decisions, and something that will make that more robust is in our recent recruitment of inspectors. We did focus, and I think the predecessor committee, if that's the right terminology, asked us to think carefully about that. So we have asked for colleagues from the sector that have SEND and alternative provision backgrounds to bolster that in our workforce as well.
Okay, thank you, Adam.
Thank you.
And Georgina?
So yes, certainly looking at exclusions and data around that would be important. In terms of the suggestion to not include children with SEND in the performance data, that's not something that we'd support. That wouldn't be, in our view, helpful or inclusive. We need data in relation to children and young people with special educational needs and disabilities. And as the Public Accounts Committee said in their recent report, SEN performance data should incorporate factors other than academic attainment. And of course, not all children on SEN support will continue to need that level of support if they get the right help soon enough either. So it should be possible to manage data so that a school average is considered alongside the number of children at the school who have special educational needs or disabilities. And I would be seriously concerned if we were to go down any sort of track of removing children with SEND from data on performance as to what would be coming next, removing them from attendance figures, removing them from site and data that is supposed to be and should be improving and driving inclusion for all, including those children.
Okay, thank you. And my next question is to Sharon and Georgina. The Children's Wellbeing and Schools Bill proposes extending local authority powers over school admissions. Does this sufficiently address concerns about exclusionary admissions practices? So over to you, Sharon, first.
I think anything that will help level the playing field will be helpful and increase fairness and transparency. But the bill doesn't address our concerns about lack of accountability on SEN admission and exclusions more generally. I think if an academy needs to be directed to take a child, there is an indication about the culture within that environment. And if once admitted there are issues, there is nowhere for that parent to go to take those concerns other than the Academy Trust, and then from there the Secretary of State. That's a very big leap for a parent to take. So again, we would say to make it effective, underpin it by the fair and simple and independent accountability structure.
Okay.
Yeah, so I would agree with that. And I think the question is, as Sharon alluded to, referring to the bill proposing that local authorities would have the power to direct an academy to admit a pupil in the way that they do for maintained schools. So broadly speaking, the extension of that power would be a positive step. And remember, in SEN law, under the Children and Families Act and also under the Equality Act, academies have the same duties to children and young people as maintained schools do. But it would only be positive if that power is then properly exercised. If it's properly exercised, it could prevent a child with SEN from missing education. And by properly, I mean complying with the requirement that's in this provision for the school that's being directed to admit to be able to make suitable provision for that child, to provide a suitable education. Suitable education is the language of the bill. And the definition of what that means includes being suitable to their SEN. So they'd need to be directing the right school to admit in the first place. And also, for that power to be properly exercised, it requires lawful consultation with the parent of the child and with the school before issuing any direction for the school to admit. But as Sharon said, extending this power alone is not likely to, on its own, remove and take away exclusionary practices. Being admitted doesn't necessarily mean being included and adequately supported. So inspection criteria, as I was talking about earlier, SEN support being statutory and the Ombudsman's jurisdiction being extended to cover schools would all strengthen that and could work together with the fact that this power may be extended to cover academies.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Independent schools are inspected against the independent schools standard, which are different because they have related increased flexibility of governance, curriculum, selections, admissions and other things. So the standards are necessarily different. But it's been suggested that in some areas of SEND, metrics for assessment, and that there could be some uniformity across the independent and state school inspection metrics. Do you think that would be helpful?
Shall I go? You're looking at me. We would say what's really important is that everyone is focused on genuine inclusion and meeting the needs of those with SEN and protecting them from discrimination. And that's whatever the type of school and whoever the inspectors are. So alignment in that regard would certainly be positive. The Equality Act, of course, applies to all educational settings. So compliance with that could easily be aligned across the different types of settings that we're talking about and form part of any metrics that were included in inspections across the board. And while the legal position is different for independent or wholly private schools compared with state schools under the Children and Families Act and exclusions law, information on children taking part in the activities of the school with those that don't have SEN and exclusionary practices that have been mentioned already, off-rolling, etc. That's always going to be relevant regardless of the type of school, so that's something that could be aligned across different inspection regimes.
And do you think that would help children with special needs, or could it lead to some schools changing admission criteria?
Well, I would suggest that if that sort of thing led to a school changing its admission criteria, that it would be risking being discriminatory in the criteria that it's setting. So I would hope there'd be a safeguard in the Equality Act from schools making decisions that would effectively implement a policy that would disadvantage those who might be disabled.
Thank you. Jess.
Thank you. So to Lucy and Adam, we've heard that health services need to be subject to stronger scrutiny to improve accountability for their role in SEN provision, which I know you've already alighted on. Are there any plans to enhance the focus on health services within area SEN inspections? And beyond that, are there any additional ways to hold health services accountable for their role in delivering SEN provision? Maybe Lucy first?
Yeah, thanks. Thank you. We have set about in this inspection framework, like I set out at the start, to make sure that where there are significant weaknesses identified in the partnership, that we are really clear about the responsible body that needs to respond to that significant weakness. More often than not, it is a partnership responsibility. So if we think about some of the challenges that we have spoken about during the committee today, thinking about EHCPs, and I know we said that we'll supply some examples of that, and also thinking about the inspection outcomes that do achieve typically positive, and that typically we see really strong joint working. We've got to be cautious in our accountability measures that we're not divisive to local area partnerships. We have taken steps during this inspection framework to attribute areas of priority action just to ICBs. Like I say, it is in the minority because of those factors that we've been aware of, and also because of the partnership working. At this point in time, there isn't a proposal to change that within our inspection activity, but the inspection activity that we complete as part of our monitoring visits and subsequent full send inspections when we go back will give us some more information about the response to inspection. NHS England have launched a consultation on their performance oversight framework, which is some of the metrics that the ICBs are held to account on. And this also talks to the point that I raised at the start, that the area send inspections are the only independent tool that holds the partnership to account. DFE and NHSC work together to support the local areas' strategic plans post-inspection, providing scrutiny and challenge. And then beyond that, that's where some of the accountability changes. So in NHS, we've got the oversight framework. If after a full area send inspection, there is a decision made by the Minister for Children and Families Wellbeing that a threshold is reached to issue an improvement notice, that improvement notice currently is only issued to the local authority. It's not assigned to the ICB partners. So there's a definite difference in terms of accountability and the accountability that falls out of inspection. But we believe that we have worked hard, and I think it has been effective, to try and name those partnerships where that are responsible for the actions as we identify them on inspection. I think the other thing to point out as well is, as part of this inspection framework, there are 2 CQC inspectors on that team. In the old inspection framework, there was 1 health inspector. Their primary role is to cover the health services. The great opportunity that we have through joint inspection and being on site together is the triangulation that we can make through trying to understand the experiences of children accessing those health services through their school or through those different services that I know you've heard about before. So those schools that might trade services and trade an educational psychologist. We can really understand what the lived experience is for children and young people in terms of accessing those services. And I think that's some of the benefits of the joint inspection activity, but acknowledging some of the limitations where that goes.
To Georgina, some stakeholders have proposed extending the powers of the SEND tribunal to make legally binding recommendations to health bodies. Do you support this proposal? How might it be implemented in practice, and do you anticipate any challenges, particularly in the resource-constrained environment that we're in?
Well, yes, IPSEA certainly would support the proposal of the extension of the tribunal's powers in respect of health and also social care. At the moment, the ability of an ICB, albeit if it only has strong and cogent reasons, but the ability of them to depart from the recommendations of the tribunal, and also what we see is very minimal involvement of health bodies in SEND tribunal appeals when health issues are still at play. These things can lead to the contents in relation to health of an EHC plan being vague and inadequate, making the health provision in those plans then more difficult to understand and, if necessary, enforce. So these are, of course, education, health and social care assessments and plans that we're talking about. At IPSEA, we often see the health and social care aspects being overlooked, so strengthening of the tribunal's powers could help overcome that. If the powers were extended and perhaps consequently a health body was made party to a SEND tribunal appeal, we would expect to see ICBs being more proactive in providing relevant evidence, something which doesn't tend to happen in our experience. And in fact, if they were a party to appeal, they might be directed to provide relevant health evidence as standard. And we would also potentially see health bodies being more actively involved in resolving the health issues that are in dispute sooner, as in without a hearing, or even better, perhaps at mediation. And we hear from mediation providers that mediation is most commonly about education issues. But even better than that, of course, perhaps the powers would help be a deterrent and get health to the table even earlier on, so no mediation or appeal about health issues was required at all. We at IPSEA equally would support the extension of the tribunal's powers to make binding orders in relation to social care for similar reasons, and we've responded to the Law Committee's review of the children's social care framework, which I'm sure this committee will be considering as well. But with the right panel composition at the SEND tribunal, we don't see why health and social care should be treated any differently from education. And if the tribunal were able to make orders in relation to all 3 areas, then it would truly be this single route of redress that it was intended to be. So it's certainly a proposal that we would support.
Just finally, there's been a recent model blueprint for ICBs, given the cuts that they face, and there are some suggestions that ICBs might walk away from SEND provision in general. I just wondered whether any of you might have any comments or reflections on that.
Yeah, I can take. Should I take that one? I think we are very aware of the significant structural changes that have been proposed in regards to ICBs. I currently don't know, and I think as a kind of a wide representative, don't know what the impact will be for children and young people with SEND. But I think that what we've outlined today is the really critical role that ICBs can play currently, but also that we think that they can go further, and it would be critical to the success of any kind of reforms or recommendations, that their role is really clear in contributing to children and people with SEND.
Yeah. And if I could add, regardless of what you've just mentioned, the Children and Families Act requires health bodies to secure the health provision which is specified in an education, health and care plan. And of course, we don't want that legal provision to change at all. And would say, almost as a final comment, that the way to improving accountability is not overhauling the legal framework. That's the opposite of holding authorities to account, whether that's ICBs or local authorities. What we need is lawful decisions to be made first time, and for parents to have an adequate route of redress when they're not. And if those decisions were made lawfully first time, then those routes of redress, like the tribunal, wouldn't be overloaded in the way that they are. If I may, I think it's really important for us to acknowledge that the fact that England's legal framework is based on children and young people with special educational needs having a right to an education that meets those needs is something that we should all be proud of. Any sort of approach or suggestion of diluting that would be a cause of significant, I think, national shame. So, just as I said earlier, children with SEN should have just as much right to fulfil their potential as children who don't have special educational needs or disabilities. So I hope that will be the main point that the committee is keeping at the forefront, or you, as members, you are keeping at the forefront of your minds in the decisions that you're making as a result of this.
Thank you very much. Can I thank all of you for coming to give your evidence to us this morning? It's been extremely helpful for the committee. Can I also say, if there are any points that you felt you were not able to get across in sufficient detail because of the constraints of time this morning, please do write to the committee after this evidence session, and we'd certainly welcome that. Thank you once again. Order. That brings our proceedings to a close for today.
Thank you.
Thank you.